So yeah, I've been working at Ableton since August 2015, and this means I suddenly found myself in the context of commercial music, which wasn't my reality at all before. And that's not only because I work on some of it, but also because we obviously get regularly informed about what other music software companies do. We get to try their software and so on. So finding myself in this completely different from the university environment, I've been making certain observations and reflecting on my own practice as a music maker, and that triggered some of the work I'll show today. I'll be talking about software instruments. What I mean with that is basically tools that fall somewhere between synthesis and sample playback. I'm gonna leave out the AW and effects. So let's see, if you Google software synthesizers, you get something like that. And if you Google software samplers, you get something like that. So you've got more waveforms here, but essentially the aesthetic is very similar. So the very first thing that strikes me in both cases is a certain machine aesthetic brought over from the analog synthesizer days, and that still persists actually in many cases. And secondly, there is this specific paradigm of computer music making with all these tools, where you have a user interface for sound design, often really, really detailed sound design that you can do through knobs and sliders and buttons, and some kind of piano-looking MIDI controller for playing, for triggering your sounds. It's also MPCs, very popular these days, but it's essentially the same thing. And this is actually a model that works really great if you're interested in control and repeatability, which is very often the case, especially in a performance setting. But this is not something that I'm very interested in. My music is mostly what we would call fixed media, and a lot of the sounds in there are basically results of fortunate accidents that happen whilst I explore a tool in the studio. I don't particularly care about reproducing a specific event. I usually play around with something I find interesting. I try to record my actions in audio files and then try to isolate what I find interesting, put it in my DAW, edit it further, and so on. So naturally, during the exploration phase, I favor tools that can be unpredictable, are engaging, and I can interact with maybe in non-traditional ways. There is an interesting distinction that Andrew Johnson is making between expression and exploration, where basically expression is more directed towards specific ends. So I definitely find myself being more interested in the exploration side of things. I'll show you first a tool that I made many years ago in Max. That was actually a university project. Alex may remember this, I don't know. Okay, it has a terrible user interface, as you can see. There's lots of text and number boxes. It's a granular synthesis instrument. I'll explain briefly what's happening here. So you load an audio file here, and I have my emission parameters. You can choose between asynchronous and synchronous emission. Set your emission rate, well, actually emission interval, that's not correct. Grain length is the original grain duration, and grain duration is the desired grain duration. So basically it's the speed, it affects the speed, the playback speed, and then that changes the final duration and the pitch naturally. Grain start selection, I think random is obvious. Linear, if you want to use linear grain start, then I had introduced this step parameter here, which is basically the interval between the onsets of 2 consecutive grains. So it parses your file in regular intervals and then it goes back again. So it's looping through a certain selection. And various other less important things like volume for each grain, panning for each grain, envelopes for each grain, but also wave envelopes, so a macro structure you can apply here. I will be using this audio file so we can compare the different instruments I'll show.
There is no sound in this deep stone network, save that of the subterranean wind, whose cause I did not discover.
Okay, so I'll load this and I'll play around a bit so you can get an idea of what kind of sounds that makes. I will deactivate all this random stuff I have on by default. I think it's clicking, I'm not sure why. Okay, so you get the idea. A few observations after so many years about this tool. The step is actually an interesting parameter, I find. It can create some interesting rhythmic results. There is also a pretty failed attempt to apply some macro structures because I have this gradual change of density, gradual change of step, gradual change of grain duration, where you give an initial value, a final value, and then a duration over which you go from your initial value to your final value, and that's all linear, so it's not particularly interesting. And I had tried to inject a certain, I don't know, unpredictability here because I have all these, the random option is pretty much everywhere. So yeah, I made this tool. I was really interested in granular synthesis, but then I realized that I can't really use this. I mean, it looks terrible and it's just all number boxes and buttons. It's really not engaging at all. The engine itself is not something very special, but I wanted to give it a chance and try a different interface. Maybe something will change, something will be more interesting. Two tools that I have been using a lot, and I don't know how familiar you are with those, are Cecilia and Catarti. So Cecilia is not really exactly an instrument, it's more like a sound generating tool. And you have this central panel here that works essentially as automation works in DAW. So you have a bunch of parameters down there and you can draw their evolution in time. There's also certain functions that create different shapes. And Catarti is a concatenative synthesis tool where it works real time as well, but you can also load an audio file, you chop it up, and then the grains are positioned in this big white space there and colored according to selected descriptors. So in both cases, I would capture my actions in audio files, then go through, isolate what I found interesting, as I described before. But something I was finding very interesting in both cases is that the central element, the action, the center of action in both cases is this big space that you interact with graphically. So I wanted to try something like that, as a center of action, basically. So about that time, I discovered the Max physics engine, and that was again for a university project. So my engine here is exactly the same as before, but it looks entirely different, completely different. And so I have added two sources. First of all, that was supposed to work initially with Wii and Nunchuck, and it was designed for a quadraphonic setup. There is actually a pretty heavy quadraphonic planner. It's still there because some interesting things happen, although I essentially use it for stereo now. And of course, the center of action I was talking about before is that. So this is your physics world here, and you can have objects in there that behave like objects in the world as we know it. So currently there is no gravity, but of course if I add some gravity, things just go down. And so there is a sphere and a cube for each source, for each audio file that you load. And the spheres in the 3D space, they control grain duration, grain length, and emission interval. And the cubes control the position of the grain, which grain in space. 2 dimensions control that, and the third controls the mobility of the grain. So okay, let's give that a go. And the only parameter you're supposed to control through this part here is just the step, like before. This may also misbehave in terms of volume because the panner is really not adjusted for stereo. So
no sound.
change the step just to see if anything interesting happens. Okay, so that's a completely different interface. Both the way I was engaging with this version and the sounds themselves are very like gesture oriented now. At some point I wanted to try other things as well. I've kept this interface for quite a while and going back and forth, changing details here and there. The newest version is let's see, it's this one. Almost. So it's long and narrow because it became Max for Live device at some point. And I'll explain here a facility that I had in the previous one, but I couldn't demonstrate it because at the time I was working with a Wii, a Nintendo Wii and the nunchuck. But I had recording facility, so gesture recording facility actually.
Sounding.
So you can press rec.
Sounding.
And then play back the gesture.
Sound.
And if you change the step, then you get different content.
Deep step. Network. Network.
Deep stone.
No sound.
No sound.
Stone network.
So you get the idea. I guess I added that because people started asking me. I would play around with this, and then something interesting would come up, and then people would be like, "Oh, can you do that again?" Well, no, not really, because I can't control it so well. I don't know. Sometimes there's collisions, the depth, it's completely out of your control. I mean, you can control 2D, but what happens with the Z-axis is completely out of your control. So I thought, okay, maybe I'll provide a facility where you can record a gesture and then maybe play it back. It's really simple. It's just a call object that I write down information about position and rotation, and then I just read back from it. And I guess I could extend that more. Like I could have a library of gestures where you record various gestures and then you can pick which one you want. And at some point I started thinking about meta parameters. So for example, I added this modulation section here where I was wondering what's gonna happen if I modulate gravity, for example. So yeah, let's try that. So gravity changes constantly according to the movement of an LFO here, and things move. And if I modulate gravity on all three axes, I can get some pretty complex movements. And you can still grab the objects around. It's just that gravity also makes them move.
Deep.
Stone.
Okay, so you get the idea. So between these two versions, I got hired at Ableton, and the first project I worked on as a Max for Live developer were the Max for Live Essentials. These are the two of the three new synthesizers we released, and yeah, something that was really interesting to me finding myself in a commercial music software environment was the number of iterations that happen until you reach the final version of your product. So we actually, I don't know, we had maybe 30 more versions of this that look pretty similar, to be fair, because we have a style guide. We can't just do whatever we want, and that's fair because you also need to have a certain coherence. But for example, it was out of the question how the elements are going to look or what colors they're going to be. So for weeks we would just think about how we should group them and where exactly we should place them. And yeah, it's great. You have UX designers and UI designers, and everyone is really thinking for the best possible version of this, and that's great. But it's also super tiring. Like for 3 weeks at least, maybe more, I was just staring at things that look like that, basically, blue and gray dials and buttons. So one day I realized I just needed to look at something different, something that looks very different from this, something colorful, something crazy, I don't know. So I thought maybe, okay, I'll just Google some Kandinsky. That looks different. And as I was looking at these paintings, I was thinking, oh, wouldn't it be great if I could just animate one of those and use it as an interface? That would be crazy enough, different enough. So I ended up looking at this one, and I don't know if you can see, but okay, it's circles on a black background, but there's certain color gradations, and there's these details here, and it feels like they're, I don't know, floating, these objects floating on some kind of liquid. So I thought, yeah, I can do that with the physics engine. I can make circles that feel like they're floating around, and that should be fun at least to try. And I actually started implementing that, but then my graphic skills are not so great, in the sense that I couldn't really have all these nice little details, and then I don't know, Kandinsky would be lost somewhere on the way. I would end up with a much simpler version of this. But I had liked a lot the idea of using a painting, modern art painting, as an interface. So I thought, okay, I need something simpler because I just can't do that. And I also maybe want something that can have a certain structure that can maybe bring something to the instrument. So for a few days I was Googling things like abstract art, minimalist art, until I came across the famous composition series by Piet Mondrian. And a bit of background on those. So Mondrian was one of the main contributors of the style movement founded in Netherlands in 1917, and the artists in this movement were seeking some kind of universal harmony. They were trying to find the ideal fusion between form and function, and so this work influenced a lot, not only fine arts, but various other fields, such as architecture, industrial design, typography, music. A very famous example of a different context other than fine arts is the Mondrian collection by Yves Saint Laurent. So the dresses that he designed in 1965, they were a massive success. And I also discovered a video on YouTube that gives you instructions on how to make a Mondrian cake. So I thought, okay, that works in many different contexts, so why not try to make a music interface out of one of those composition series? I thought that this looks doable, the composition C painting. So I spent some time trying to think how I'm going to animate it. I thought of several possibilities, so I decided it would be interesting to have those behaving like springs, basically. And the idea was to map my different parameters on the different sides of these shapes. So I don't know, this side of the red square could, as it changes position, it could be controlling, let's say, I don't know, grain duration, and so on, for each rectangle. And then this is creating some interesting rhythmic relationships as you basically orchestrate, as you pull the springs, and then it feels like the parameters are getting orchestrated, and they also slowly evolve, they slow down, the rhythm slowly slows down. So here you can basically experiment with mapping the different sides of the different rectangles to different parameters. Let's try something. Clicking. Again, I'm not very sure why. I'm just trying out a few values here, try to get different results. And they're hard to catch with the mouse when they move. So I'm just mapping parameters in different to different rectangles here, and I just get slightly different things in time. Okay, you get the idea. A couple of things I added in this version is this center value thing where it's a center value for grain duration, grain length, and then I also add some deviation. I did that basically so I don't always want this massive changes in pitch, so that keeps things a little more contained. And I added this randomized range thing, which so if that's 0, then the step is doing what I was doing before as well. But if it's something else than 0, then it just creates a range within which the onset of my grain can be anywhere, and then the step is actually moving the range within the selection and then back again. And then if that's basically as big as the selection itself, then step doesn't make sense, it's 0. And I also thought about playing maybe with some meta parameters here. Couple that are relatively interesting is the stiffness and the damping. So stiffness. Okay. Let's remember how this moves. Oh, that happens too sometimes. That's because I touched the stiffness. So it was like that before it was 20. Then if you put something like 100, things get crazier. And then damping, of course, decides how many repetitions you get in a way. And yeah, I mean that's basically it. Sometimes more interesting, sometimes not as interesting. But I guess that's the whole point of exploration, of having an instrument that it's exploratory. It's not always interesting, but sometimes it's really good. So I don't know. Do I have how long do I have left? I can show maybe a little bit how I did those things in Max. It's frankly really easy. It's really high-level programming. I'll show first. Let's see. I'll show first the previous one because it's actually simpler. And physics interface. So this setup is really great. So the setup with the spheres spheres and the cubes I was showing before is actually really basic in Max. So all you need is this jig.phys.world object. So this is creating your physics world, and then you give it the size, and you can of course control the gravity. All these parameters are communicating with the phys.world object, and then for the objects themselves, you need a jig.gl.grid shape object. This is creating the shape. I think the default shape is sphere, but then if you say, I don't know, shape cube, like here, add shape cube and add color something, then it just changes the shape and the color. And then if I connect the grid shape with the jig.phys.body, then it also starts responding to the physics world. So it responds to collisions, to gravity. I can also control, another interesting one is bounciness. Unfortunately, that only works if one of your objects bounces on top of another one. So for some reason, it doesn't work with. It doesn't have any effect on the walls of your world. So a way around it is to just cover your walls with panels, and then these are objects, and then you can get some bounciness. Unfortunately, I haven't done that. Maybe that would have been interesting, and that's really it, frankly. And then that's what that was that. The recording facility, I think. So I was just I'm somewhere storing all these things in a call object somewhere that here, call position one. So at regular intervals, I take the position and the rotation of an object, I write it down in a call object, and then I just play those back when I want to have a gesture happening again and again. The other one, this one. So again, I have my physics world here, the physics object, the size. In this case, it's 2D, so I give 0 to depth, so I just have 5 by 5. And again, the grid shape and the physics body, that's for the black lines that behave like springs. And for them to behave like springs, I need this object here, the jig.phys.60OF, that means degrees of freedom. And then I can set things like point of equilibrium. That's how I position the springs in the first place in different places, and to recreate the painting. And stiffness, for example, is here. And to draw the rectangles, I actually used the g.gl.sketch which is a lot cheaper to use than grid shape. So initially I had implemented the rectangles with grid shape, but it was really expensive. It was getting stuck, it was slow. The calculations that happen are also not very convenient. So this is just basically drawing the rectangle. Something else to note for that is, so I have a retina display here, and there is this bug in Max where when you render on retina display, it does 4 times more calculations than it needs to. So I had to run Max on low resolution for this to work well, and for this interface, the Mondrian painting to be responsive. And so I don't know what's the moral of this story. Definitely, I'm not saying that physics engines are the future or anything, or that we should, I don't know, dump all the traditional looking synthesizers and replace them with modern art. That's a personalized take to alternative interfaces. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people, lots of individuals that work on really exciting things. But unfortunately, most of the commercial software, which is a software that gets all the visibility in the end, is really narrow, and it's really self-referential in a way. It's referencing a lot its ancestors, and I think it would be great if we got to see more often things that are a little, I don't know, unusual. It's software after all. There's no reason why it should be limited. There's tons of possibilities like these.